Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. I'm not going to give a long introduction to either speaker. I think you'd much rather focus on what they have to say, and you do have copies of their biographies. But I think both have considerable expertise in Syria. Donatella Rivera has been an observer of what has happened in an extraordinarily difficult and volatile situation. Aram Nerguizian has been not only a frequent visitor to Syria, but worked in Lebanon and in the Gulf region. And I think it is all too obvious how urgent this issue has become. We have announcements now not only of what may be a new major incident, but the possible movement of Syrian chemical weapons. And we face a coming deadline and a confrontation potentially between the West, China, and Russia over whether the UN mandate and the UN effort should be continued, where we have something I think like 9 days in which to find out whether we can really move forward on this incident. So let me let the speakers speak. Let me begin with Donatella and let her make her remarks, then Aram, and then we'll open things up to questions. Thank you very much.
Thank you. I've recently spent several weeks in Syria, in the north of the country, investigating human rights abuses, many of which have crossed the threshold of crimes against humanity and war crimes. I was in Syria without the approval of the Syrian government because the Syrian authorities have not allowed human rights organizations to access Syria. So I crossed the border. I think the term is illegally. And obviously, inside Syria, I worked in 23 different towns and villages. In 3 areas of the country in the north, in Aleppo and around Aleppo, in Idlib city and around, and in the Jabal al-Zawiya, Jabal Wastani area, which is further south, just north of the city of Hama. I'd like to start by talking a little bit about Aleppo, which is the biggest city, the wealthiest, the economic capital of Syria, and the last place in Syria where there is no armed confrontation between armed opposition and government forces. Aleppo has been very late in joining the protest movement. It didn't start as early as 17 months ago as in other parts of the country. It's been in more recent months. And the way that the government forces have dealt with the little bit of protest when it began has been exactly like everywhere else in the country. During the week that I was in Aleppo city, every day I saw small demonstrations, varying from a few hundred to maybe a few thousand people. Within 15 minutes, the security forces would intervene. The security forces and the paramilitary Shabiha militia, plainclothes, working alongside the security forces, would intervene and fire live rounds, mostly Kalashnikov assault rifles, but also hunting rifles. In one single day, for example, on the 25th of May, 10 people were killed, 10 demonstrators and bystanders, 2 of them were children, and several dozens were wounded. Not only they fire on the crowds of demonstrations where there is no use of violence, no threat to anybody. Quite the contrary. People were sort of clapping with their hands raised above their heads to show that they had nothing in their hands. Then they go after those who have been injured, anybody who's been injured in a demonstration, and this has been so very much throughout the country from the beginning. Cannot go to hospitals because they will be arrested. So you have mostly young medical students, doctors, nurses, people who've done first aid training who perform a very important task, which is of providing life-saving emergency treatment. Those people have been particularly targeted by the regime. 3 weeks ago, 3 young men, 2 fourth-year medical students and 1 English literature student, but who'd done his first aid course and who were part of this medical team who were providing treatment to injured demonstrators on the floor of apartments where they were at risk and the owners of the apartments were at risk too. The 3 were arrested, and after a week, their bodies were found with clear marks of torture. Their nails had been pulled off, their teeth missing. They had been shot in the head, and their bodies had been set on fire. So, to give a very clear message that it's not a good idea to engage in this kind of humanitarian task. And this is just sort of one of many examples. Elsewhere, in the other 22 towns and villages, it was a very different story. By the time I got there, I was there in April and May until the beginning of June. It was already open armed conflict with the armed opposition, which is present throughout the country in different strength, and government forces fighting it out in rural areas. But more importantly, I went to this specific area to investigate a string of very brutal military incursions that had been carried out by Syrian government forces and militia from late February through to early April. And really, in all the areas, I found similar patterns. I'll give you a couple of examples. In Sermin, security forces, soldiers went into a house where 3 brothers were sleeping with their mother and their sister. They took the 3 boys out. They were aged 22, 24, and 26. They were construction workers, sort of, simple guys who had participated in demonstrations but who were not involved with the armed opposition. And in fact, that's why they had stayed in the village. They hadn't fled because they figured that they hadn't done anything. And they weren't particularly worried about the army. The army had gone into town the day before, so they knew the army had come into town. They were asleep when they were dragged off from their bed. They were shot in the head outside their home, and then their bodies were set on fire. The mother and the sister were not allowed to collect the bodies until, this happened at 7 o'clock in the morning. They were not allowed to collect the bodies until 7 o'clock in the evening. In another place in Jabal al-Zawiya, in town of al-Bashariya, the army swept in. A young man who was with the armed opposition but was not armed at that time ran up the hill to get his 3 little cousins who were aged 8, 11, and 13 to get them back home. The army caught up with them, made the 4 of them kneel on the ground, and shot them dead. And the little one, who was 8-year-old, was shot not just in the head, but in the palm of the hands. Other children, other shepherds, these children were up in the hill looking after the sheep. Other children who had hidden in the area told me that he was kneeling on the ground with his hands up when he was shot. And these are just really individual examples of cases that I found by the dozens, and for a period of 5 weeks that I spent in Syria. In every single town and village that I visited, big or small, houses had been burned down to the ground. In some villages, half of the houses, hundreds of homes, as well as other property. Medical facilities, pharmacies, certainly field hospitals, but also ordinary clinics were burned down. Quite clearly, it wasn't just a question of some soldiers lighting a match, because the burning was absolutely thorough, from ceiling to floor, from wall to wall. So incendiary devices were used. which indicates a level of premeditation, because soldiers on a normal round don't carry hundreds of incendiary devices with them. It's not what patrols carry. So they would have had to carry those with a specific intent. The other reason why, quite clearly, we cannot talk about possibly the actions of some rogue elements who are acting on personal initiative. That cannot be the case because the patterns are too similar. I found the same modus operandi everywhere in different parts of the countries. Brutal summary execution, burning down of large number of homes and properties by different units who were operating in different parts of the country at different times. So quite clearly, this is state policy. They also, of course, everywhere, in every town, in every village, took away mostly young men. The same as, those who were killed were mostly young men, but also elderly people and children. And it was the same for those who were arrested. The ones that I could speak to were obviously the lucky few who had been released. They bore horrendous marks of torture and open wounds, and they all said that they had got off lightly, that it was much worse for those who had stayed behind. And we can believe that, because obviously those who were arrested, those who were released, were people who the security forces had no longer any interest in, or whose families had paid a lot of money to get them out. So a small number of cases. And there are hundreds that we at Amnesty International know about, but many, many more too, who are disappeared, who have been detained, some up to a year ago, and they have never come back, and their families have had no way of knowing where they are detained. Whenever they contact the different intelligence agencies that are responsible for the detention, they are told that they're not there. Sometimes families manage to get some news because they hear from people who have been released and who tell them, I was detained with your son in this and that place. In most cases, they have no idea. Their relatives are disappeared. As the conflict worsens, we also have to be mindful, and increasingly so, of the behavior of the armed opposition. The armed opposition was formed after several months of peaceful demonstrations being shot at, and demonstrators being killed and injured, and anybody mildly suspected of having been in any way involved in protest demonstration being rounded up and tortured, and in some cases disappeared, and in some cases killed. But be as it may, an armed opposition was formed, and it is becoming stronger and more organized. It is engaging in a more efficient way in recent weeks with government forces, and sort of gaining more ground in recent weeks. And they too have begun to commit human rights abuses. It is for now at the level of individual cases. But we all know that in situations of armed conflicts, things can escalate very quickly. On this, I would like to have a small digression on the issue of the term civil war, which has been used in the media quite a bit when talking about the conflict in Syria. I don't think that we are in a situation of civil war. It hasn't been a community killing another community, sort of, as a kind of private initiative. The monopoly of violence has been very firmly in the hands of government forces. Syria has a certain ethnic composition. The sectarian issue in Syria has not started with the uprising, goes back many, many decades. But there is certainly a danger. One, because some of the developments that we've seen since the first large-scale massacre that was reported on the 25th of May in Hula and which has not completely been clarified until this day, right up to the massacre that was reported last night. The reports in these cases, which remain to be verified, I must stress, are of militias from Alawi villages going into Sunni villages with the support of the armed forces that shell the area with tank fire, artillery from afar, and then these militias going in and finishing the job, so to speak, killing people. There have been those 3 or 4 cases, but by and large, it's been a situation of government forces targeting their opponents because they are their opponents, because they protest. The danger, however, as the conflict continues, is that it could sort of acquire a greater sort of sectarian element, which would obviously indeed be very dangerous. And I would like to end with just a few words about the role of the international community. Certainly, while I was in Syria, everybody I met, in town, villages, smaller community or larger one, if there was one question that everybody was asking was, why is the world doing nothing? Why is the world watching? I mean, the Syrian uprising took place in the context of the Arab Spring, as it's called. And of course, people in Syria saw that in Tunisia and in Egypt, people were able to bring about change, fortunately, without it becoming armed conflict. In Libya, of course, it was a different story. There was intervention by the international community. And in Syria, the world has watched and done nothing. The international community is certainly paralyzed on the question of Syria in a way that it was not in the case of Libya. But looking at it from the perspective of a human rights organization whose interest is first and foremost the protection of the civilian population, it is striking, first of all, if one goes back and looks at the kind of debate that was being had in the spring of 2011 as the Syrian uprising began, very quickly, the only option that was really being discussed by the international community was should there be a military intervention or not, sort of comparing it with Libya. And the answer was no, that there wasn't going to be a military intervention. But there was no discussion of any other initiative, and there could have been a number of initiatives. For example, the situation in Libya was referred to the International Criminal Court within 2 weeks of the first demonstration ever taking place. We are now 17 months into what has become a brutal assault on civilians. And the leaders of the free world are still discussing whether it would be useful or suitable to refer the case to the International Criminal Court. We've seen the international community agreeing last April, 3 months ago, to the presence, to the setting up of a United Nations mission in Syria. It was certainly a case of too little and too late. And by the time it was dispatched to Syria, the UN supervision mission in Syria was there with the wrong mandate. It went in to observe a ceasefire. There was no ceasefire, not for a single day, and it was absolutely, obviously clear to anybody who wanted to see it that there was going to be no ceasefire. Neither party wanted a ceasefire. Things had moved too far by then for ceasefire to be a realistic option. So two useful things that should have been done much earlier on, but that would still be useful now, would be for the situation in Syria to be referred to the International Criminal Court, and for the mandate of the UN mission, which is expiring next week, to be renewed, not in its current form, but to be expanded, to be given the authority and the necessary human skills and capacity to carry out investigation into war crimes and crimes against humanity that continue to be committed. The use of that would be that it would be sending a signal to the perpetrators of these abuses that the time for impunity is over. Again, I think that it is regrettable that that message was not clearly delivered to the concerned parties right at the beginning, but it is certainly not too late to do so now. And I'll stop here and I'll be available for questions.
Thank you very much, Donatella. Aram?
Thank you, Donatella, for your comments. And the challenge in Syria is that from the operational ground level all the way up to the strategic picture of the Levant, you have levels of complexity and a kind of challenge that, frankly, the region hasn't seen in decades. And what my comments will focus on is taking us from the internal dimension, the regional, the international, and all the obstacles therein, and mapping out what is likely to be a pattern of instability in Syria for the foreseeable future, to say nothing of the next 5 to 10 years. Now, the roots of the crisis, as many of you know, are tied to socioeconomic disparity, the mismanaged distribution of national resources, social mobility, challenges in places like Deraa, that were the wellspring for protests. Now, the crisis has evolved at a pace and scale that has metastasized both the internal politics of the opposition, has metastasized the responses of the Assad regime, and if one thing can be said of the Assad response to grievances at the popular level, is that while every lesson from Libya, Yemen, Egypt, and every other authoritarian system about what to do to maintain power does very little to translate into a path forward for a future for Syrians and for a way out for the Assad regime. It only prolonged the crisis and has made things that much more intractable. And what you have now is a far more polarized environment, no meaningful channels of communication or trust between the regime and the opposition. You have every perception that this has now ballooned, and has been so for quite some time, into essentially a struggle for power in Syria. And that is shifting on both sides in terms of the very nebulous opposition within the country, to say nothing of the external opposition in foreign capitals like Paris and elsewhere. You have on both sides an effort to shape the message in terms of what is actually happening in Syria. And the realities of that mean that you have essentially a battle for what the course is in terms of the right steps that the Assad regime thinks it can take versus the steps that the opposition is taking, and who is or isn't conflating the truth. There's no grounds to assume that Assad is painting a picture that is close to reality, but that doesn't change the fact that both sides have been battling to craft the message. And all of this has been happening in a context where you have a regional environment that is far more polarized and far more divisive than at any point in the last few decades. Syria very firmly now sits on a broader regional Sunni Shiite fault line, not necessarily by design, but by default. The level and scale of competition between the Gulf states and Iran, and the polarization along the rhetoric of Sunni Shiite competition have made Syria intractable. Even if the struggle is between a Alawite-led regime and a predominantly Sunni opposition, that doesn't change the fact that this fault line impacts the crisis. And therein lies also the effects of Gulf competition with Iran, more specifically in places like Hormuz, about regional hegemony. And all of these things do complicate the Gulf and the Iranian responses, with efforts to secure tactical outcomes, in the case of Iran, to provide for some kind of longevity in the Levant, access to Lebanon, support to Hezbollah, and at least trying to shape some of the outcomes in Syria, versus the Gulf states led by Saudi Arabia and Qatar that are trying to reshape the balance. And this complicates their responses because you do have a difficulty in reaching any kind of viable consensus at the regional level about what to do about Syria. Everybody wants to negotiate so long as they get exactly what they want, which is not exactly the definition for negotiation. And beyond all of this, at a much broader regional level in terms of the historical shifts, the Gulf states in particular find themselves at a crucial crossroads in inter-Arab politics. This is the first time in decades, if at all, that they can really shape regional outcomes at a time when the three traditional pillars of the Arab state system, namely Egypt, Iraq, and Syria, are either sidelined or unable to change events. And that has shaped some of the tactical choices about competition in Syria. This idea that whatever emerges locally will most likely be predominantly Sunni and can be supported in order to create an alternate structure to the Assad regime. All of these things complicate a struggle that 16 months ago was essentially a grassroots effort to shift the debate about what Syria's future should look like, what governance should look like, what economics should look like. And beyond the regional level, you do have a lot of instability at the international level because, to echo or to add to some of Donatella's points, and maybe to answer one of the questions, there is no international community on Syria, and there is not likely to be one in the near future. You have actors like the United States that are struggling with the lessons from past experiences in places like Lebanon and Iraq, countries with deep communal divisions that the US could not and cannot fix decisively in any short-term effort. And here, in the context of a country like Syria that is very close to the epicenter of Arab-Israeli politics, very critical to the stability of neighboring states like Jordan, Lebanon, Iraq, and Turkey, to say nothing of the stability of Israel as well. And the reality that the view from Washington is that there must be a strategic outcome in Syria, one that maps out some kind of stability at a time when states like Egypt remain unstable. Jordan has seen shifting leadership over time. And all of this is critical in light of Iraqi concerns about its own internal stability. None of these paint positive scenarios for Syria's future. You have a regime that will continue to repress, will continue to adopt the lessons learned from other cases of authoritarian failure, but will not be able to chart a path forward. You will have continued support from external actors, which will make the kind of scenarios and on-the-ground experiences that the Syrian people are suffering that Donatella described all the more intractable over time. This is going to be, as I said at the beginning, a long-term crisis. And even if Assad were removed or to leave, it would not change the reality that whoever runs Syria will have to face the socioeconomic, political, and communal ramifications for the next decade, if not longer. We can talk about some of the other points during the question and answer period. Thank you.
Ladies and gentlemen, let me throw things open for questions, but before I do so, let me ask a favor of you. If you look around, you can see how many people are in the audience. A lot of them are going to want to ask questions, so I'm going to ask you the favor of actually asking a question, not making a statement or a speech, having the question be simple enough so the panel has a chance of actually answering it. And before you actually ask that question, could you please indicate who you are and the organization you're a member of, if it is an organization that you're speaking for. So with that, let me ask who has the first question. And forgive me if I don't identify those of you I know by name. I'm just going to point, but the lady in the front row. Please.
Thanks, Tony. It's Barbara Slavin from the Atlantic Council and allmonitor.com. And the question actually is to both Donatella and Aram, and that is, we read that the opposition forces within the country are getting stronger and that they have de facto control over large swaths of at least the countryside at this point. Is that the case? And if so, particularly Aram, why are you so pessimistic about their ability to defeat the Assad forces? Thank you.
Certainly in the whole of the north, which is where I was, and I understand it's no different in other parts of the country, it's kind of a shared management of the land, if you will. The government forces are present. They have checkpoints on the main roads. Sometimes they put up sort of flying checkpoints at intersections with smaller roads, and the smaller roads you can move if you're a bit careful and kind of, always check ahead that there isn't a sudden sort of flying checkpoint. So it's that kind of division of labor. Also, even on the main roads at night, the government forces tend to kind of lock themselves up in the tanks and sort of, not stay very visible. So I wouldn't say sort of total control that the opposition have anywhere, but they certainly have operational ability to move around.
Well, Barbara, thanks for your question. Well, first, you have to understand that a static snapshot of what's happening along the frontier with Turkey is something that is not going to capture the scale of what's happening between the regime forces and these units that are operating as part of the opposition. There have been reports, and none of them completely accurate, about command and control by opposition forces in places like Idlib. Some of the mapping we have seen suggests overwatch over significant portions of the province, reporting that, frankly, I am somewhat suspect about. I mean, there's a lot of indicators that there are strong pockets of control along the Turkish frontier. There is a reluctance now by the Syrian military to send the kind of messages that could aggravate further a already difficult dynamic with Turkey. That being said, the Assad regime still has, and this is to your other part of your question, still has enormous repressive capability. They have always expected, as far back as the early 80s, that the next battle that the security apparatus would have to face would be something not unlike what they saw in the 70s and 80s. So you have an ideological military. You still have far too many desertions as opposed to defections. You still have a fair amount of command and control. But the challenge that this attrition battle really poses to the regime is that they're engaged in a struggle that always shifts, is like a game of whack-a-mole. You have an opposition that bleeds away, has learned not to stay and fight till the end. And this just means that it's going to drag things out further. And that's partly why I'm pessimistic. I'm pessimistic because neither side is able or willing to make the kinds of decisions that slow the pace of violence. I would not be surprised if we're talking about this kind of cycle well into the end of the year, if not into next year.
Let's see, I'm going to try to spread things around the room. The gentleman there next to the gentleman with the microphone.
Thank you. Britt Minchell, Renaissance Institute, Baltimore. I've been listening for months on this thing, and I've been waiting for someone to give a percentage of population of Syria.
I'm
In other
sorry,
words,
would you
everybody-
ask a question, please?
Yes, I'd like to find out what is the percentage of opposition as opposed to Assad forces.
Why don't we take a couple of other questions at the same time? Let's see, the gentleman in the second row there.
Hi, John McGaffin from CSIS. Donatello and Aram, I appreciate that. You're more horrific than I thought. I was surprised, however, that the role of sectarianism was not greater. I see its role outside Syria, as Aram talked about. But could you draw out a little bit more of the sectarian Alawis, Sunni, other Shia, Christian roles, how they play in this? Thanks.
We take one more question, the gentleman in the front row here.
Thanks. I'm Harlan Ullman. I'm a disciple of Tony Cordesman's. Poor me. My question is for the entire panel. When you look from the Levant to the Bay of Bengal, you can describe it possibly as July 1914 in slow motion. What does the panel think of the chances for all this violence in Syria to spill over to Jordan, Turkey, elsewhere, and become a catalyst for a larger regional conflict?
Donatello, again.
Okay. Percentage, I think we would all love to know, but the situation in Syria just does not make it possible to conduct that kind of research. I mean, there is either people, journalists, few who are in Syria with government approval, and their movements and their actions are tightly controlled and observed and monitored. And then there is others who go in illegally, and they have other challenges in terms of, how much they can move about and what they can do and so on. So it's very difficult to know with any degree of certainty either what is the percentage of support amongst the population for one side or the other on the one hand, as well as, exactly, I mean, the numbers of in terms of, what's in the Syrian army, that's, reasonably well known. What is less well known is how many people have actually defected. Again, the figures vary or deserted. The figures vary greatly. So I have not seen a figure of the exact number of members of the armed forces that have deserted that I consider to be reliable and that I would go with. I think there are various figures, but it's still a small percentage. Spillover potential. I mean, I'd like to rewind back to Libya, because that was one place where the international community acted or reacted with lightning speed. Everybody was united pretty much on what to do. There was a small group of people who named themselves the National Transitional Council that essentially represented themselves, not anybody else, but they had a good contacts in mostly in Western capitals in America and in Europe, and the whole world fell in love with them. Completely forgot to talk to any of the people, because I mean I was in Benghazi and everybody was at the Uzu hotel. Nobody was bothering to speak to ordinary people on the street who had other ideas, and everybody thought that Libya was going to be so easy because there aren't the sectarian issues that you have in Syria with different communities. It's a very homogeneous, Sunni. They forgot about sort of tribal and other differences. It came to pass that Libya, the regime fell, and now you have 100 militias in a single city like Misrata and many hundred more. And when there are disagreement, people don't solve it anymore by having a punch out, but they fire Grad rockets at each other and RPGs from across the street. And the situation is very messy indeed. All this to say that in terms of when you talk about spillover, I think that the parameters of analysis that have existed for a very long time in the Middle East have been sort of thrown up in the air in the last year. A, because those who brought about change have not been the traditional oppositions. They just haven't. In any of this country, they're trying to play a role now to a larger or smaller degree of success, but certainly the opposition played no role from Tunisia to Syria. It's been young people who've just come out and got us to where we are in the different countries. So it's just to say that, I mean, I see too many of the parameters of the old analysis that has been used for decades to predict what may or may not happen, and I don't see enough taking into account when analyzing the situation today of a new reality, that the actors of change, at least the change that has kind of deeply shaken the country. Then, of course, you still have the older guys trying to, find a place in the new Egypt or in the new Tunisia when they were really not very present during the uprising, and they really didn't play a decisive role, if any, at all, in bringing about the downfall of the regimes. So I think that's something to really bear in mind. And the second thing that I would say, and the last point, would be that after the French revolutions, they got Napoleon. It took many decades before democracy. So what has happened in the Middle East is the beginning of a process. And it doesn't matter what in each country there are challenges. Tunisia, Egypt, Yemen, Syria, Libya, they all have their own different challenges. But in none of the country, it's going to be great. There will be, even in the best case scenario, there will be internal conflict, internal strife at different levels, because people who've been denied of the possibility to have a free press, to have free expression, to have free assembly for decades, are going to need to find their own way to create spaces for debate, for resolving their differences. So I think that, while applying the old parameters of analysis, is worth bearing in mind these, rather new elements.
Well, first on the question of if you can reliably map out if there's a percentage that supports the opposition or supports the regime, I think it's hard enough to map out the players involved in opposition politics as it stands. You're not going to get a reliable picture in terms of accurate numbers. What is clear is that you do have a very large cross-section of the Syrian population that has to deal with the reality that the myth of a unified Syria under some language of Arab nationalism has essentially been pulled out of the equation. Now you have a lot of communalism. You do have communities like the Alawites, like Christian minorities, and some heterodox Muslim communities that really, they can be critical of Assad, but in a context where they don't know what the alternative promise is in terms of socioeconomics, the role in politics and security, you still have a sizable pocket of support. And even within the Sunni community, there is enough evidence to suggest that, at least for ideological, if not self-preservation reasons, you have a significant portion within the armed forces that are hanging in there because of the real threat that they face should there be some kind of de-Baathification, not unlike what we saw in Iraq. So you still have a significant cross-section, but one that is being affected by the scale of the brutality of the Assad regime, and you do have these kinds of defections or people being sidelined. Now on the question of, again, sectarianism, look, the Assad regime has mobilized the communal dimension of the crisis since the beginning, but it has largely lost control over that message. It's taken on a life of its own, it's polarized society, and you have a lot of mob politics that impact this. So going forward, I think the communal dimension and the potential divorce between communities could be a source of instability and will require true leadership. And that's something that is increasingly scarce in Syria. In terms of the chances of spillover effects, look, Libya is a country that imploded, and Syria is a country that is going to explode if things continue at this pace. You already have instability in Lebanon. The northern provinces like Akkar and North Bekaa are essentially launch pads for opposition activities in Syria. You have a Sunni community in Lebanon that is very much in the same kind of frustration and politics of the Shiites before them in the 1970s. They feel leaderless, and they feel that they have common cause with their brethren in Syria. So already Lebanon has become increasingly unstable and subject to the effects of the potential tsunami of instability from Syria. Jordan has already seen a number of prime ministers come and go, and it's not a good sign for stability in Jordan. And there are pressures there in a country that has few sources of revenue from rents and is reliant on external support for stability. And even Turkey has to face the reality that it has an 800 plus kilometer border with Syria. It has its own minority concerns. It does have its own sources of instability. And of course, Iraq has to deal with its own Sunni Shiite problems. So the spillover effects are critical. And one thing that is clear on Syria, and again, I have to stress this point, in none of the countries where we have seen regime change or changes in the distribution of power do we have any sense of certainty that the players who are shaping events today will either be relevant or able to shape outcomes in the future. This is not the kind of cycle that one can assess in 2013 or 2012 alone. We're going to have to assess this over time, and who ultimately inherits the centers of power is deeply uncertain.
If I may make just a brief comment, I think that both panelists have raised an issue which needs far more attention. These are changes taking place in a region which for decades has seen economic and demographic pressures build on a largely national level, where there is really very little regional integration or even regional economics except for local security arrangements, where the pressures that are outlined in the Arab Development Report are going to be extraordinarily difficult for any government to solve. And that report basically drew the conclusion that many of them could not be adjusted by a competent government in less than a decade, simply because of the youth pressure, the economic pressure, the disparities in income, and the problems in governance. There is a warning that I think really needs to be drawn, particularly by Americans, a confusion that somehow there is an easy route to elections, and elections produce legitimate governments. Historically, elections do not produce legitimate governments. Virtually every election held in the post-colonial period did not produce a legitimate government or one that could survive for even half a decade. The precedent historically, even in Europe, is one that we might bear in mind. And I remember a very senior Arab official making this point, that it was insane for Westerners to talk about an Arab Spring when Westerners had their own experience. They had a spring in 1848. It lasted arguably till 1914, and it did not end well. And I think this is perspective we might really want to keep steadily in mind over time. The gentleman in the second row over there, and we'll take another series of questions. Oh, please, over there on the right, my right.
Good morning. Daniele Moro, Johns Hopkins University says. The question is, while it's very clear to me who is supporting in some way the regime, I would like to know, in your opinion, who, if it's true that in the opposition there are also minorities like Christians, Alawites, and Shia, or it's just a Sunni uprising? Thank you.
Let's see. The gentleman in the far back over there, I think it's a gentleman, I'm sorry.
Thank you. My name is Mohammed Abdullah. I'm a human rights activist from Syria, and I'm a former prisoner from Syria. My question is to Donatella. You mentioned the ICC, the International Criminal Court. Russia will veto easily because we need a Security Council resolution. We're back to the same dilemma. And I'm not sure if I understood this very well, but you described the mission of the UN observers as a useless thing because there's no ceasefire. And then you asked to extend
question, please.
Yeah, I'm asking. What do you expect if expanding a mission of useless group? They're not going to do anything. And my last question to you is the issue of the armed opposition, because we really share the same concern about our country. There's lots of weapons, and nobody going to collect those. How to deal with those, because there's no something called armed opposition. Anybody picking up arms is armed opposition.
All right.
So who's responsible
we get the
for that?
question.
Thank you.
The gentleman in the front row here. Please.
Good morning. My name is Ypsira Ayala, and I'm from the Leadership Academy on front of the building. My question is, what's the position of the international community on Syria, and do they have any plans or actions to take on like stabilizing the community and stopping the violence of Syria?
Thank you.
Thank you.
Donatella, do you want to begin?
Who supports the armed opposition, I think, was the first question. Yeah, that's a good question, and I think it's the answer is likely to possibly keep changing as the situation develops further. Some of the armed groups that I saw operating in Syria had one Kalashnikov between 4 people. They were extremely poorly armed. That has changed a bit in recent weeks. The last week that I was there at the end of May, I saw some more and newer, still light weapons in the hands of armed groups. They have also been able to capture more weapons from temporary military camps that they have been able to overrun. Obviously, there are different players outside, mostly, who seem to be offering help. None of it is done very much in the open, so I don't like to work with speculation, but with facts. So for now, I think that I'm not going to say any more because I have no certainty and I don't like to speculate. But certainly what I think is clear to all is that there are, different players, as in any other conflict, who, might have an interest in influencing things and may choose to do so by providing supports of different kinds. To the question over there, ICC, Russia would veto. It hasn't been tried. I mean, we've seen that Russia and China agreed to the UN mission, to the Kofi Annan plan. I think it is regrettable that the international community did not think outside the box and did not try to address and to look at options which were options outside the military intervention. That is what I think is regrettable, that from the very, very beginning, the debate that was had was should there be military intervention or not, and not look at other options. So there has been no serious attempt. It is quite clear that Russia has been playing a very obstructive role, but it is also too easy to just blame Russia, because even the governments that are talking tough today, only 4 weeks ago there was an initiative by the Swiss government precisely to try and rally support for going to the Security Council and tabling a resolution on referring Syria to the ICC, and countries in the northern hemisphere, shall we say, we're still saying, well, maybe we should give the Kofi Annan chance a plan, as if the two things were mutually exclusive. So, let's they haven't tried, and that's regrettable. With regard to the role and the mandate of the UN mission, I didn't say they were useless. I said that by the time they got there, the mandate that they were given was inadequate. They were there to observe a ceasefire. That was the mandate, and there wasn't a ceasefire to observe, and there isn't going to be a ceasefire to observe anytime soon. But what we would like to see is the mandate to be renewed but expanded, for them to be given a mandate to investigate human rights abuses, crimes against humanity, war crime. And obviously, if they're given the mandate, they will also be given the human resources necessary. In terms of the question on the role of the international community, I mean, as I said earlier, the international community has very much focused only on looking at what is the possibility for military intervention, and concluded that that was not a desirable route to go down, and it hasn't really done very much else until now.
Aram?
Well, in terms of the question on minority representation within the opposition, the reality is by de facto as opposed to by design, it's been very difficult to build an opposition that has minorities in meaningful leadership positions. Yes, there have certainly been Syrians who belong to minority groups who have distanced themselves from Assad, but that does not change the fact that, at least at the level of perception, the opposition groups remain largely dominated by Sunni demographics. They might not be mobilized along those lines. One has to be very careful about pigeonholing any one group within an opposition that is disparate, not properly organized, and has no coherent long-term plan for Syria. That doesn't change that many minority groups are cautious. On the question of the UN mission and whether it should be renewed, you have to look at the alternate scenarios to a diplomatic outcome in Syria. They include a protracted civil war, not unlike what you saw in Algeria or Lebanon, which will go on unabated and will metastasize further, and no one will have any sense of what the final outcome will be. Beyond that, you have the prospects of deepening instability and communal division. The Annan plan was the right idea at the wrong time and not supported by enough of the players that mattered locally to say anything of internationally. It's only now that people are starting to come around to the reality that this is going to become a very messy and long-term crisis. And in any form, there does need to be some prospect of a diplomatic effort. A lot of what we're seeing is deeply depressing and negative on Syria. That doesn't mean one has to completely close off a diplomatic track. And on the question of whether or not, what is the position of the international community? Again, there is no international community on Syria. You have a very divided political sphere. You have disunity of the Security Council. You have a Russia that is deeply suspicious of any Western effort in Syria. It's largely based on events in Libya and what they view as the erosion of their interests in the region, to say nothing of their own internal pressures tied to expansion of NATO. And all of these things make it very difficult to chart any meaningful course when it comes to Syria. So it's not a very good answer, but it's as close to the truth as anyone can find. And it's not very clear what any player at the international level can do in the short term to stymie the violence.
Ladies and gentlemen, I have been instructed to end this discussion formally at 11:30. I would like to thank Donatella very much, particularly for giving us a picture of human rights issues which is on the ground and based on realities which often seem to be very distant. But I'd like to thank Aram for providing a broader perspective, and may I ask you to thank them in the usual manner.